So should I have started already? I should have, shouldn't I have? Okay. So hello everyone. I'm sorry about that. I was waiting for a cue. My name is Craig DeLarge, and I'm here today to host what is going to be a good and stimulating discussion with my colleagues that you see here on the screen. The topic is going to be about wired but isolated. How do we grapple with loneliness in a digital age? Just a bit about myself. I'm a digital mental health strategist, researcher, and advisor who's done work with Headstream Innovation for the last 7 years now. And some of you might recall other webinars that I've been on in the past. Um, about um, mm, Forgive me here, I'm a bit discombobulated. About Headstream, this is a webinar series that's hosted by Headstream Innovation, bringing together passionate voices to explore all things related to youth mental health. What I want to now do is leave some space for my colleagues who are here on the screen with me. And you guys, we're going to recover here. Let's start with Danielle and then go to Milena, then Chris and Jillian. Please take a minute to introduce yourselves and the work that you do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig, and thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Daniella Ivanir. I am the Youth Engagement Manager at Half the Story. Half the Story is a leading nonprofit empowering the next generation's relationship with technology. As Youth Engagement Manager, I run all of our youth-led programming, including a civics academy that we do in the summer, training and creating a pipeline of youth leaders for the future of responsible technology, as well as our teen advisory board and different efforts that we're doing, including our New York Teen Tech Council, to actually inform distraction-free learning and phones-free school policies with centering youth voices at the center. My background is in peer mental health, which I started at 15 years old, working at a hotline and actually listening to teens across the nation. I then went on and created a hotline at my college at UC Berkeley, and now I get to work with young people every single day on hearing what their experience is like growing up in the digital age. And I'm thrilled to be with all of the panelists today and just explore this topic more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Milena.
Sure. Yeah. Like Daniela, I am so thrilled to be here and explore this topic with you all. I feel like I'm in such good company. I'm Milena Batalova. I am our Director of Research and Evaluation at Making Caring Common. We are a project of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and our whole mission is to enable adults to raise young people and nurture young people to care for others and the common good. So I, as researcher and evaluator, I take my role really seriously. I make sure that we apply the research, and the research being interdisciplinary on empathy, morality, bridging, social psychology. And we apply that research to all our programming and our resources. And I, in particular, help to evaluate or spearhead our evaluation projects when it comes to K-12 and parenting resources. And so, yeah, I'm really thrilled to be here. And I should also say that in the past few years, in particular, we've led a lot of our own national research around social and moral issues pertinent to life in America. So, that includes mental health in young people, loneliness, and polarization. So I'll be very eager to share some of our findings and loneliness in particular.
Yeah, Milena, I really enjoyed reading your report and really looking for your insights today.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Chris.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Appleton. I'm the founder and CEO at Art Pharmacy. We are a social prescribing organization that works nationally with partners in healthcare, education, and community-based organizations to address the dual mental health and loneliness challenges in the United States. Social prescribing is a practice through which healthcare providers and other trusted care team members prescribe participation in community-based activities. So we work with doctors, school-based mental health providers, caseworkers at health plans, counseling and psychological services team members to enable them to prescribe participation in going to a dance class or on a nature hike. going to a visit to the museum or the theater to support young people's mental health. We're currently working with partners in 8 different states, and really grateful to be a part of this conversation today.
Very nice. And Chris, social prescribing is one of my favorite public health topics these days. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to share this next hour. Jillian.
Wonderful. So glad to be here with all of you. Jillian Racoosin Kornmeyer. I have the privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Foundation for Social Connection. Our mission is to advance social connection nationwide, rooted in evidence for our collective well-being. And as a body with our Scientific Leadership Council and our network of partners, we really work across research, practice, policy, and field building to think about how we can advance social connection for all. We do a lot of work at the community level and then all the way up to the societal level, working with national governments. And so excited to talk a little bit more with you all today about how we're thinking about approaching social connection from a population health standpoint.
Beautiful. Okay. Thank you for those introductions. So everyone who's tuning in, you can see that we've got a real powerhouse of knowledge and insight and experience with us today as we explore this topic. So what we're going to do now over the next 30 minutes is we're going to explore a series of questions that I'm going to be putting to the different panelists. I'll be calling out who I would like to address the question. It'll be 5, and then there'll be one at the very end that's going to kind of be opened up to everyone. In the meantime, for those of you that are listening in, we want you to be offering your questions in the Q&A section of the user interface that we have here, because we are going to make time at the very end in order to field those general questions that come in. So let's get started here. So this first question I want to direct to Milena and to Jillian. We'd like to hear from you. What do you think are the most important insights for organizations and funders working with young people today? And what might be missing in how we are currently understanding this topic and the concern around loneliness? Go in whatever order you like.
Okay, I can take this first, Jillian. So thanks for elevating this. I think that there's a general myth that it's the older populations who are loneliest because they might be at greatest risk of things like isolation, limited mobility, illness. And while the risks can't be, pretty high for much older groups, they're also high for younger adults. So in our research last year, the report I mentioned, we found that millennials, so ages 30 to 44, followed by young adults ages 18 to 29, were most at risk. And this could be for a host of reasons. With young people in particular, for example, we do know that they feel like a great sense of financial uncertainty. They're overwhelmed with achievement pressure, and they want a sense of community, right? At a time when meaningful community might be hard to come by. And I think another insight is that I think we're missing the complexity of it. And this is kind of a trademark of loneliness research, that one can be isolated and not lonely at all. Or one can be surrounded by people and friends and still feel deeply lonely. And it might not necessarily be because they're lacking emotional closeness or vulnerability, even though that may very well be. It might be because of existential angst. We don't talk enough about existential loneliness. And that's that sense of disconnection from yourself or from others or from the world. And so in the report we did, or in the report we published, we highlighted that about a quarter of Americans feel like their place in the world isn't important. And that was actually really high for young adults. It was 30%. So I think when we work with young people in particular, we really need to prioritize interventions that target both social cognition, so maladaptive thoughts, or negative thoughts and expectations we have of ourselves and other people, but also really structured opportunities for authentic connection. Sometimes we may need one more than the other, but from intervention research, we know that a blend of the two approaches works really well. And I think ideally, interventions that can really personalize to the experience of loneliness will do the best. So, figuring out what's really going on, what the young person needs now in the present, but also over time.
Okay, thank you for that. Jillian.
Yeah, I'll jump in and completely agree with a lot of what Milena has brought up. We know that young people have emerged as a high-risk population for loneliness prior to the pandemic, but has continued to rise, through the pandemic and afterwards, and also specific intersections, so youth and BIPOC, young adults, LGBTQ populations, to grow the concern even further. And unfortunately, young people are often left out of the discussion and really need to be central to thinking about prevention and intervention design. Something that Milena touched on is, loneliness in the definition, right? And thinking more broadly about, loneliness actually isn't all bad. It's actually a psychological response to a distressing feeling. And sometimes it's necessary in order for us to make a change in our lives. So we have to be careful when we're saying things like we want to eradicate loneliness or end loneliness. That starts to be similar to saying like we want to end sadness, right? And what we want to be thinking about is the chronic state of these conditions. And that's where we need to focus on those clinical interventions. Because loneliness is a subjective feeling, it makes it more difficult to generalize solutions. And again, that's what Milena was talking about. We really want to think about tailored approaches to, alleviating chronic loneliness and contributing to more social connection. You asked about some of the questions we still have. I think that we are missing some answers still about loneliness and how it differs for youth and young adults that are growing up in the world today. And we want to be thinking about broader than just loneliness between, an individual and themselves and in interpersonal relationships, to loneliness and disconnection from systems, communities, environments, and start to solution around what will bring us together despite modern plagues. A report that our team released this summer was around navigating generative AI and youth social connection. That is a critical topic area that we are paying a lot of attention to. If anyone's interested, social-connection.ai is that resource. And while there's still a lot to learn around the long-term impacts and implications of generative AI on youth social connection, there are some things we do know. And we also do know that dialogue and conversation between generations is really key during this time that we still have a lot of uncertainties. So in that resource are a lot of opportunities and toolkits for conversation and dialogue between generations around generative AI use and its impact on social connection in youth.
So thank you very much for those responses. I just want to recap very quickly. 3 things that really jumped out at me and what you said. That loneliness is not loneliness, that there are many dimensions to loneliness, which is a really interesting sort of nuanced thing. For that reason, interventions need to be tailored. And Jillian, thank you for calling out that we need to be careful about pathologizing what is just a human response to a state of being or situation. That loneliness is something to be responded to effectively, not necessarily eradicated. So thank you for that. Okay, so now let's move on to our next question. Chris and Daniella. So as we're thinking about this topic of social prescribing and the potential that it may have for helping us to tackle both the loneliness and the mental health crisis, can you share some creative and community-based interventions that can complement traditional healthcare? And what lessons can entrepreneurs in our audience take away from what you've come to learn about the role of social prescribing?
So at Art Pharmacy, our approach to social prescribing has really been focused on getting individuals access and participating in existing resources in their community, in particular, arts and culture activities like a dance class or a museum visit. And want to always acknowledge that artists have been healers since the beginning of humankind. Art, culture, creativity, and when I say the arts, I mean music and visual arts and theater and a big tent idea of the arts. Artists have been healers since the beginning of humankind. In so many ways, there is nothing new here. In fact, hundreds of years ago, the arts used to be a greater part of medicine, of healthcare. And at some point, it began to split. And I think when that happened is when we began thinking about healthcare only with what we could see with our eyes through a microscope that we could measure physically. And that has gotten us a long way and will continue to play a really important role into supporting whole person health. But when we think about the biopsychosocial model to health, right, health isn't only the absence of disease, right? It is the presence of well-being in all aspects of our life. And social connection and belonging are essential to whole person health. And so to do that, we need to operationalize people's connection and personalizing, as other panelists have shared, the personalization of the right type of community-based activity for those individuals. And so our approach to doing that has been to use technology and a care model to enable healthcare providers to prescribe participation in these community-based activities, and then matching young people to the highest efficacy activities based on their unique needs, their health goals, their cultural identity, their demographics, their clinical needs, their social needs, their experience engaging in art, culture, and community-based activities in the past, to really get that right fit. One of the things that we talk a lot about at Art Pharmacy is how for our physical health, increasingly healthcare consumers are asking for, even demanding, not just personalized, but precision medicine, as we should be. But when we get discharged from the doctor or the hospital, for our mental health or our social health, it's not very personalized. You get an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with a few words written on it that says, here are the resources available to you, good luck. And that is not how we can really address this issue of connection and belonging. It does need to be personalized. The good news is that the assets and resources are already there. There are few museums and theaters and community art centers and dance studios across the country or across the globe that would say, hey, we've got enough of an audience, stop sending people our way. In fact, there's unused inventory that's just available on the shelf at most every arts organization across the country. And they are there and ready to help support young people's sense of belonging and connection.
I love that. Love that. Okay, very nice. Thank you for that, Chris. All right, Daniella.
Yeah, so cool to learn more about that, Chris. So
Yeah.
I think at half the story, we think about loneliness as a symptom as many things, right? But it's also about culture and it's about social norms. And culture change happens from within the community that you're trying to reach. So in this case, we're talking about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. In my work, and also as someone who is Gen Z, I have seen that culture and those norms of socialization, they're intertwined with technology in a way that those that didn't grow up with online tools since the beginning of their adolescence might not fully understand. It's not always clear where one begins and one ends. In my work, I've seen that young people that we work with are craving nostalgia and craving a different time, craving a time before brain rot or fast-changing micro trends or being chronically online. They're searching for safe third spaces, for platforms that give them autonomy of what they're consuming, and for organic, real-world connection. At the same time, I think that many adults overlook the value that young people also get in digital spaces. So the creativity, the community, and inspiration that they get. So at Half the Story, one of the most meaningful things we do through our programming is actually connect those students to each other. So from a very young age, I saw the power of peer support. I worked at a hotline where at 15 years old, I was taking calls from across the country. And I like to think about it like, oh, was I the most qualified? In some ways, yes, because I understood what it felt like to be that age. And I believe that sustainable change in how young people are connecting can really come from a culture shift built in their own bedrooms, in their own classrooms, in their friend groups. At Half Their Story, we've done this through a couple different initiatives. Last spring, we actually had a program called Screen Free Prom, where we empowered young students in their schools to actually opt into having a screen-free prom. And I traveled to San Francisco and Salt Lake City and actually helped them lead a part of their prom where the kids at the door would check in their phone for a wristband that they could switch out for like digital cameras and Polaroids. And so I thought that was such a cool idea. And it was actually birthed from our teen advisory board. So again, like those are the things that actually are changes within a community group to make something cool and to make something actually work. So for entrepreneurs, I'd like to just offer two things to kind of think about. One, how do you use digital tools to actually move them offline? So things like Book Talk, which is like a whole community of TikTok where students are reading more. How do you use that to get kids to go to more bookstores? And the second piece is really thinking about how do we create non-judgmental spaces for young people to share and to talk to peers about what it was actually like to grow up online and what future they'd like to build for themselves in the future.
Very nice. Thank you for that. So just a quick recap here. Chris, thank you so much for reiterating this idea that the arts are healing and have always been, going back to Hippocrates and beyond, have always been a part of healthcare, but which we've lost. And that the resources that we are available to us to do this are right in our communities, not necessarily in the clinic. And this really gets at the idea that community-based healthcare and approaches are really going to be important. The point of tailoring keeps coming up over and over again, so thank you for that. And then, Daniella, thank you so much for bringing up the importance of culture, which also lends itself to tailoring. The importance of peers and how technology facilitates that support. And this book talk thing that you talked about, I definitely want to check some more into that. So very nice, very nice. All right, so with that, let's go to our next question. This now is going to be focused to Daniella and Milena. So, young people often describe loneliness not just as feeling alone, but also as feeling disconnected, and especially in digital spaces. From your work in youth advocacy, what do you think are the biggest opportunities and risks for fostering authentic connection? Here we're talking about the quality of relationship, not just the quantity of relationship. In whatever order you'd like, we're interested in what you have to say about that.
I can jump in. So the first thing that I think about, and Jillian, I think you actually touched on this. So there's been a lot of research lately, and a recent report actually came out from Born This Way and Hope Lab, specifically on digital spaces for marginalized youth, especially for LGBTQ plus youth. And it's super interesting. They found that 44% of LGBTQ young people that they surveyed were feeling very safe in digital spaces compared to just 9% in person. So I think this disparity is like really showing us what our in-person spaces are looking like and feeling like for young people. I think it definitely reflects a need for more, like I said earlier, third spaces and more places of like how our policies and the way that our society is built at the moment isn't necessarily encouraging teen socialization or ensuring its safety, especially coming out of the pandemic. And so from our youth advocacy, I think, one, I find that the young people that we work with have a really beautifully nuanced take on this, which I think is so, so important. Again, like we found here, safe digital spaces could actually be a protective factor for marginalized youth. And so we don't want to throw away that opportunity and that potential. At the same time, we do find an increasing harm in some of these spaces, especially how much time young people are spending on these apps, what sort of content they're getting, especially when it's dangerous content. So I think one thing that's super important is really understanding that digital spaces cannot replace real spaces. And our young people are oftentimes surviving in the situations that they already have. And so I think, again, like I said earlier, how do we kind of create that retention from an online space to become an in-person space? And I think that that's a huge opportunity. And Craig, I'm glad that the book talk point excited you. I think that there's like a lot of really interesting communities that exist online that really easily could be moved into things that create more connection. This is kind of a silly example, but our young people actually were reporting on something called these like lookalike contests, where young people were coming to like squares. So I live in New York City, like Washington Square Park, and actually having these lookalike contests that were, just posters that people put up, and then they would come, and it was also posted on TikTok and all of that. And then they would have like a judge and they would rank them. What I thought was so interesting, and one of our teens wrote an article about this, it was almost like a pageant in a Times Square. It was going back to this previous way that we used to connect. And so I think, again, using digital spaces to use them as a tool to think more about, instead of what's sticky, more about like what's calming, what's connective, what's empathetic, and then really supporting our young people and actually being able to be in those spaces. We have policies right now that are actually encouraging, discouraging young people from being those spaces, from loitering policies to trespassing policies. How do we actually encourage young people, especially marginalized young people, to feel safe in these spaces?
Very nice. Very nice. Okay, Milena.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Daniella, I love all the points you just made. So important to focus on quality, safe third spaces. In our research, we find young people do say they want and prefer in-person interactions. When we list, a bunch of types of interactions, including online, the overwhelming majority does want in person. But to your point, especially with marginalized populations, they don't necessarily feel safe or good for them, right? So we really need those spaces. I think the major risks we run into, though, when aiming to foster connection, any authentic connection, whether it's online or in person, are at least twofold. There are two that really stick out to me based on research and programming. One involves selection bias, and the other is lack of authenticity. So with selection bias, the very real risk is that we're not getting at the populations who need intervention most. The folks who are doing okay or who experience transient loneliness, right? Like Jillian kind of alluded to this. There's chronic and then there's transient. And those are the folks who are more able to motivate, right? And go to events, participate in programs, be involved. But the ones most at risk, who especially suffer from chronic loneliness, might not be going, right? They're harder to reach. They're not getting that targeted enough attention. So that's, that really needs to be a big focus of ours in any programming policy work that we do. The other risk is that while there are a lot of really cool, new, dynamic, opportunities out there, I really like the chess rave idea. I heard about it happening in Manhattan. We don't have one in Boston yet, I don't think. Or soul cycling classes that encourage people to stay after and talk and connect. Great. I think these are great opportunities, but they might not be getting at the authentic part, right? So they could be fun and that they could be really novel or cool experiences, but it is possible that many people can easily also leave feeling even lonelier, right? Maybe they're like one of the few who went on their own while others still went in pairs or in groups. And this speaks to the selection bias that I talked about. Or maybe they just the activities aren't structured well enough, right? They don't have quality, thoughtful prompts and activities to actually help people connect and vibe. So you might leave feeling like you didn't really connect with anyone, that you didn't vibe with them. And that might reinforce feelings that maybe it's a you problem, right? Not a we problem. But the opportunities really are there. Like Daniella was saying, young people in particular, are so hungry for connection. And those who might not be as motivated or able to seek connections, they really require our creativity and our persistence, right? As funders, as practitioners, as organizations. I think the one thing that I hear about over and over, especially in cross-sector meetings, is the need for sustainable cross-sector partnerships. And I think this is where technology in particular could be really helpful, right? It could be a really great initial touch point to get young people to connect in person. It could be a good nudge or motivator. Or it could also provide people with sustained skill training or coaching while also supplementing in-person activities.
Okay. So, Milena, when I hear you talk about the cross sector, are you talking about, like, say, between education, public health, healthcare, and social care as sectors? Are you talking the digital versus analog, or in person versus the gatherings where there is volume of relationship emphasis versus a quality of relationship emphasis?
Yeah.
Succinctly help us with those distinctions when you say sector.
I think more so the first two you talked about.
Okay.
So for example, Daniella gave some really good examples of what digital spaces can look like.
Yeah.
One that I just love, also because I love the founder, is Blue Fever. They call themselves this like online community diary where people, especially BIPOC, and it wasn't intended for any targeted population. It just so happened that it invited people who may have felt marginalized or vulnerable in some way to share and seek mental health support and really find community. I think it would be really cool for a place like Blue Fever to also then partner, right, with nonprofits that do a lot of in-person work. So, places like us, places like Only 7 Seconds, where you could then connect youth who are online to doing things in person as well, right? I think that could be a really neat cross-sector type partnership.
Okay, very nice. Thank you for that. Well, Daniela, I want to thank you in particular for really validating this idea that just because it's digital doesn't mean it's productive, but we also have to make sure that we've got a proper balance between the digital and the in person. And then, Milena, I like how you further dimensionalize this opportunity around selection bias. That we need to understand that the same way that loneliness is multidimensional, so are those that are grappling with loneliness multidimensional. And we need to make sure that the people who show up and say, I don't want to be lonely, excellent, they showed up, but we need to also find ways to connect with and go find those who are also lonely but who may not raise their hand and show up at Soul Cycle or the rave that you alluded to and that sort of thing. So thank you for that. All right, so let's move to our next question. Now this one is going to be focused towards Jillian and Milena. So your foundation is focused on creating systemic change around social connection. What role do you see philanthropy and nonprofits playing in shifting norms, policies, and investment to make loneliness less of an individual problem and more of a shared societal responsibility?
Thanks so much, Craig. It's really been a fascinating conversation so far, and I love all the examples that have been brought up, so keep them coming. One thing that we wanted to make sure we did from the start is kind of shift from thinking from a deficit lens of isolation and loneliness and really thinking more towards our protective lens of social connection. And that's, really why it's central to our name as well. Because loneliness and social isolation are not an individual fault. And I think historically have kind of been seen as, oh, it's your problem, or, pick yourself up by your bootstraps type of thing. But really it's an outcome of unjust systems and conditions that don't allow us or enable us to have opportunities for thriving connection. And so a lot of what, is central to our work is what we call the social framework. And kind of touching on what Milena was talking about with our sectors, we similarly look at all sectors of society. So thinking about health, education, food and nutrition, workplace, the built environment, the arts, etc., and how those really interact with each other and act as drivers towards advancing social connection. And then we think about, the connected individual at the center, and then the socioecological model going out. So individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, and society. And then in each of these, we think about, what role do those sectors have to play, those actors and stakeholders, and make sure they see themselves as part of the solution. So for example, the example that Daniella talked about with the lookalike contest in the park, well, wouldn't it be amazing to also bring in Parks and Rec, right? Or, thinking about built environment partners that could be supportive to making sure that that public space is, accessible and able to bring those people together. So really thinking, strategically about how we bring those sectors of society together to make opportunities for social connection possible and allow them to flourish. So, as we think about interventions, oftentimes we're thinking about the individual level or interpersonal interventions because they're easier to evaluate and to study and oftentimes to deploy. But when we're really thinking about community level social connection, we want to think about policy systems and environmental approaches. So again, some of the policies that have been brought up about, loitering or other things that, even thinking about the there's some businesses that get tax credit to loaning their space out to other social infrastructure groups, social clubs in the community to allow them to use their space. So thinking creatively about policy systems and environments that allow conditions for more social connection. So those are some of the key things I would say, just as we're thinking about shifting from the individual to a more community level approach. A lot of our work is also grounded in developing community coalitions and collaboratives. We built the action guide for building socially connected community, which is an online resource and curriculum. And really that whole purpose is to help shift this narrative from me to we, right? We can work collectively to create the condition in our community where everyone can thrive and connect.
That's beautiful. Okay, so what I took from that, Jillian, is hashtag ecosystems. Being ecosystem minded and getting outside of the box of whatever organization we happen to be working in. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, Milena?
Yeah, I really love this question, and I love everything that Jillian said because we automatically recognize the need to shift from individual blame to a more societal concerted effort. So even in our research for the report last year, we found that the majority of Americans, 65% of Americans, do in fact blame our society over individuals, over lonely people themselves. Specifically, that our culture and our institutions do not care about community. And 60% blame people in general. So not lonely people themselves, but people in general, specifically that people are too focused on themselves or their small circles. So, you can think of it as ecosystem, and I really like how Daniella talked about it. I think this North Star needs to be a culture change. I think we really need to focus on shaping a whole culture that truly cares for the collective. And much of it can start within our social infrastructure, right? The policies, the programs, the places in our communities, where in our local communities, we can then expand connections and we can see them trickle out. And I think this really echoes what our former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, called for repeatedly. I loved his now seminal report on loneliness, and his two calls in particular concerned philanthropy and broader institutions at large. Because you asked about philanthropy in particular, and with philanthropic foundations, Dr. Murthy really emphasized that they should increase the scale of investments to strengthen social infrastructure in local communities. And we also need to do that by supporting research. And I'm not just saying this because I work in research, but we really do need good research, evaluation, and innovation around social connection, especially at the local level. And the second call for action was what we at Making Caring Common have written about a lot, and we also urge institutions to do more broadly, is to play their part, right? So we work a lot with schools, K-12 schools. And so we really need to urge schools and education systems to take social connection seriously and to make it a core design feature of how they function, right? Everything from how they start school orientation at the very beginning of the school year to how they're helping or not helping their students actually initiate and sustain connections, because we know that those connections are actually super vital for how students feel about themselves. And then in turn, that affects how they learn. And of course, I do want to point out one thing Dr. Murthy said in his advisory, because this is a webinar on digital life. He really called for tech companies and media to reform digital environments, right? And I think of the reforms, two are given, right? They need to be more transparent about the products that they make and like their impact on us as a society. They need to set really high quality safety standards, especially for young people, especially as AI ramps up. But at the heart of it, right, and I think this is where the real challenge lies, is like they need to care to be intentional about what they're designing so that we can avoid features and algorithms that continue to maximize really negative or hostile engagement, right? From everything from being stuck in our echo chambers because of disinformation or social comparison, but rather actually fostering healthy dialogue, learning, ideally relationships.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Milena. What I take away, just quick summary, is collective care. I love that point that you made there. And then this idea, what I'm going to call greater accountability for social profitability alongside financial profitability when it comes to the tech companies, and also when it comes to philanthropy, really continuing to have greater accountability around their role in social support. And especially as we see changes in priorities with how the government is investing in this area, those two need to be working together. And we need to be capitalizing on that with an ecosystem. So very nice, very nice. All right, so we're a little bit behind time, but I think we'll be able to catch up. What I want to do now is move to our final question before we get to the audience Q&A. I'm going to ask each of the four panelists that we have with us to answer this question. So we recognize that loneliness is a deep human challenge and that solutions come from a lot of different places: education, healthcare, youth movements, the arts, philanthropy, etc. If you could share one call to action for our audience of young professionals, organizations, and funders, what would it be? And I'm going to ask Chris to go first. One call to action for our audience.
Yeah, my invitation to the audience is to make a longitudinal investment in this work, with no blame or motivation assigned. I think it's important that we consider the billions and billions of dollars that have been invested from the private sector to politics that have helped create the conditions that led us to the moment that we're in, with this social disconnection and loneliness epidemic. And it's just been a tremendous amount of money. So private sector, public sector, philanthropy need to make longitudinal investments in this work, whether it's from the policy and systems level work to supporting individuals at the community level in order to move the needle on the challenges that have emerged over the last decade.
Daniella?
Great. Yeah, I guess I would tell the group, and I'm going to use the context that I'm still considering myself a young person, even though I'm aging out soon. No decisions about us without us. Youth-centric approaches are not about showing young people a product or a program once it's finished and getting feedback. It's about empowering and calling them in from the beginning to share the values that teens are facing today and infusing their own language, design preferences, and goals into what you're designing. And I ask you also to search for the deeper issue. So I'll give the example of phone-free schools. If we're taking phones out of school right now, what are we plugging students into instead? Are we empowering youth innovation and new norms around joy in their own spaces? And are we putting capital towards that and really empowering youth voice in a meaningful way that isn't tokenized?
Cool. Thank you for that. All right, Milena.
I'm going to borrow from the infrastructure piece, and I'm going to say it's to treat connection as infrastructure. So just like we should invest in roads, schools, clean water, I hope we do, we need to invest in the relationships that hold our communities together. I really, truly think our greatest antidote to loneliness is each other. And my call to action is to really take that seriously, right? To build up the places and the programs and the policies that actually make it the norm to care and connect. And in that report, I mentioned that we put out last year, when we asked Americans what would it take to reduce their loneliness, the number one solution, encouragingly, is something that we can all do. Something like over 80% of people said it's to reach out to one another. So I think it's really up to all of us to help mitigate loneliness.
That's beautiful. Hashtag social reproduction is what we're talking about there, right? Very nice. Thank you for that. All right, Jillian.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with all the panelists. So I echo, but I guess I'll just add, we need each other to do this work. So collaborate, don't reinvent the wheel, right? Work with each other. Let's link arms and really think about how we can partner to reverse the trend of disconnection, right? We want to move toward this upward trend of connection, and it's going to take time. It's going to take investment, as Chris said, and it's going to take each other. So collaborate, link arms, and let's get to work.
Very nice. Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so now, with the time we have left, I want to address a few of the questions that have come up in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask each of you quickly to share what is a small and practical way that you build meaningful connection in your own daily lives? Give us tips here. And we can go, let's start with Jillian.
Ooh, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I will start with something that we do on our team, which is that we start every meeting with a moment of connection. So whether it's just our team, of people at our company, or if we're on calls with funders or partners and clients, every meeting starts with a moment of connection. So we take an opportunity to really learn more about each other as humans and beings, not just as workers. It's funny, we talk about human beings, right? But a lot of us are human doers, but we are beings and we can sometimes just be. And so whether that be a prompt about, what happened over the weekend, or my favorite is like your favorite trend that you participated in high school or middle school that you might be embarrassed by, different things that help us get to know each other on a different level. So that's one thing that I would suggest you all take to your teams if you can.
Okay, very nice. Let's see, Daniella.
Yeah, so I belong to a cohort that went out to the job market after spending probably like a year and a half of college in COVID and working mostly remote jobs. So I actually think it's quite difficult to find moments of connection. It's actually just easier to be in your home, which is really difficult. So I guess mine would be constantly challenging what I could do at home and trying to not do it at home. I think that's as small as like going to a bookstore instead of ordering a book online. And I think I like to think about it kind of as how we used to when we were kids and had extracurriculars. So your gymnastics class on Thursdays and your ceramics class on Tuesdays. I try and treat it that way, of going back to taking workshops or classes. I joined a poetry workshop recently that I actually found through Instagram. So shout out to digital platforms for that one. And try to go to yoga a couple times a week. So yeah, I guess challenging what you could do conveniently in your own home and doing it the harder way.
Yeah, that makes me think. Meetup.com has been very useful for me in that regard. It's a digital platform that facilitates personal connection. It's almost like we have to be our own parents. I remember when I was a kid, when I finished my housework, my mom would say, "You go outside and play, and I don't want to see you until lunchtime or dinner time." And we've kind of lost that in this current time, but maybe we need to get back to being our own parent in that way, right? Very nice. Milena.
Yeah, Craig, I love that. That's really hashtag be your own parent. I love that. Well, I'll keep it simple. You know how I ended with being there for each other. And that's what a lot of us do really want, is reaching out. I try and practice that. So after, a week or two have gone by, I really try to pause and be intentional about who I have not reached out to. And I really try to focus on people like that I may not have been in connection with for a while, right? So I don't just stick to like my own circle, right, of close friends. I really try to make sure sometimes, and a lot of the time I fail and I feel really bad and I have to use the excuse of, I'm so sorry, I've been so busy, things are hectic. And I just hate how that sounds, because I really truly believe we need to kill busy. I think busy culture is really counterproductive. But at least I own up to it. I apologize. And, I really make that effort to reach out.
Okay, well, Milena, I need that on a baseball cap. Hashtag kill busy. All righty. Okay, Chris.
Two come to mind for me. The first is I'm in a running group running clubs are a wonderful thing. But personally, I'm just in a running group with 4 other guys. We get together a couple of mornings a week before our kids get up and go on a jog. And this started during COVID. And these are all people that I knew before, but spending that hour with them in the morning a couple of times a week has created some really deep relationships. And they're individuals that I've come to really count on to process what I'm going through, and just like the ups and downs of life. And then the other is volunteering. Whether it's, I live across the street from our neighborhood park, and, being involved in volunteering at the neighborhood park or at our children's school. I have the amazing privilege of being on the board of directors at the Foundation for Social Connection. Service is being of service to others is a really great way to build community.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Chris. Sometimes I wonder if that is not one of the most available, but also too often neglected opportunities that we have actually in the society for addressing loneliness. Okay. Thank you guys for those responses. And I'm sure the audience appreciates that, because they've got some tips to take forward. Now, I'm looking through a list of questions that I have here. We won't be able to get through all of them. Then we may do some follow-up responses to these. But Milena, I'd like you to address this one. So you talked earlier about this distinction between those that are lonely, but they will be proactive in addressing that loneliness, but those that are less so. There was a term that we used, but you get my point, the difficult to get to come out. Someone is asking, do you have any suggestions or anything that you've seen in your research for how to draw out or draw into community and connection a loved one or a friend who happens to be that more challenging, more at risk citizen that is dealing with loneliness?
Yeah. So I say this from more experience, not necessarily a programming. I think this is a really serious challenge. Maybe the term you were looking for was the chronic, right? The chronic lonely. And And oftentimes, right, really serious loneliness is correlated very strongly with mental health issues, right? So that's something else that needs to be acknowledged. There's depressive symptoms, anxiety, really lacking meaning or purpose. And so these are really serious issues, right, that may not be so easily attended to just by a friend. And I think that's important to acknowledge. That's why we need really good mental health services. We need really good wraparound social supports. But, for those who do want to help and who do want to be that motivator, showing up. I honestly think like the most simplest thing I could say is showing up day in and day out, not giving up, and really trying to urge or motivate that meaning or purpose part. I think really when it comes to it, it's like people are looking for something that matters, right? Whether it's they feel like they matter to others or they feel like they are of value to others or, something greater. So what's, in my own experience, when I reach out, especially for maybe my more vulnerable friends, it's like doing things that I know they might really enjoy or that matter to them. And it might sometimes mean doing things I don't really enjoy or care for. And that's okay, right? It's not about me, it's about them. And I think that shift, like understanding that you have to remove yourself and your own preferences or desires and actually focus on someone else, that can go a long way.
Wow. So what I'm hearing there, Milena, is that we are the intervention we are waiting for.
Absolutely.
That the way to address loneliness in those that I love is to be the loneliness intervention by making time and presence to be with them.
Yeah.
Wow. That's big. That's big. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So someone else didn't ask the question, and I'm going to ask someone to address this in a minute or less because we're running short on time. What suggestions would you make for creating these connective spaces that get people out of their isolation and into these spaces of collection, whether they're digital or non-digital? Anyone want to tackle that quickly?
I'll just do a plug if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
We did a whole report on the built environment and ways it can be, contribute to social connection. So if you look on our website and our social framework report on the built environment on housing, transportation, and housing, transportation, and environment, we have even kind of like supplemental reports that talk about promising strategies, but a lot of it talks about, how to make places that are public accessible, that are safe, that are welcoming, right? All these things that are the same things we want for digital spaces. And there's great, organizations that are doing work on the online space front, like New Public and others that are looking at how do we create the infrastructure for online and offline spaces that are safe and welcoming. But check out the report.
Yeah, we need to get those resources into our show notes or something like that. Very nice. Okay. So with that said, and less than a minute to go, I want to thank all of the speakers for their meaningful contribution today. I want to thank all the attendees for attending and joining in this discussion, and we really love the questions that you ask. We invite everyone to keep an eye on our upcoming webinars that we'll be fielding. You can find those at our website at headstreaminnovation.com. And we wish you all a great rest of the week. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.
All righty.
Thanks.